Hi, my name is Leland Joshua Bernard. I am a student in Professor Griffin's class, English 1302, and this is my video lecture for my research project titled Mortal Kombat, a look at the effects of video game violence on behavior. My thesis for my project is that I do not believe that violent video games cause behavioral problems, as older studies into the issue were flawed, and several recent studies on the issue have determined that there are no long-term behavioral effects. The early concerns since their widespread availability beginning in 1970, video games have been an issue of controversy. As early as 1983, the U.S. Surgeon General speculated that video games might be a leading cause of family violence. Consider that the games of the time were the likes of Pac-Man and Centipede. As the technology and the graphics became more advanced, games like Mortal Kombat and Grand Theft Auto turned concerns into outright fear with their enhanced graphics and depictions of vivid violence. Concerns specifically over the violence presented in Mortal Kombat were largely responsible for the creation of the ESRB. Early research, coupled with sensationalist media, tapped into and exacerbated societal fears about video game violence. Proponents of the idea that video game violence led to real-life violence often noted that serial killers played violent video games. In the case of the Columbine shooting, it was noted that Harrison Klebold played the game Doom, a game that the Army used to train soldiers to kill. The attorney for the DC sniper claimed that Lee Malvo had used Halo to become less hesitant about shooting human forms. And Aaron Alexis shot up a Washington naval yard the very day that Grand Theft Auto 5 was released. However, a closer look into these issues reveals a different truth. Regarding Lee Malvo, the DC sniper, Aaron Alexis, who shot up the DC naval yard, and Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold from the Columbine high school shootings, all of whom were linked to playing violent video games, in each case, all of these killers were assessed as having deep psychological issues that greatly outweigh their interest in video games as an influence on their violent actions. In the case of Aaron Alexis, one overzealous press outlet, The Telegraph, ran an article headlined as Aaron Alexis, Washington Navy Yard gunman, obsessed with violent video games. And this was before any details about Alexis or the incident had emerged. Statistics do not lie. A comparison of violent crime rates to video game popularity from 1995 through 2010 shows an inverse relationship. Crime was going down as video game sales were skyrocketing. The Secret Service conducted an in-depth study of the 37 targeted attack school shootings that took place between the years 1974 and 2000 and found no accurate profile connecting violent video games to these crimes. Here's a chart that displays the violent crime rate versus video game sales from 1995 to 2010. As you may be able to see, the rate of sales for all video games were going up, while at the same time the rates for all violent crime were going down. Despite the statistics showing otherwise, and the fact that no study had linked violent video games to violent crimes, or even meaningfully aggressive behavior, the APA issued a strong resolution statement in 2005 advocating, among other things, for the reduction of all violence in video games and interactive media marketed to children and youth. Fortunately, the scientific community spoke up. 228 members of the scientific community, media scholars, psychologists, and criminologists, signed off on a letter to the APA sponsored by researcher Christopher Ferguson that pointed out the lack of scientific evidence to support the APA 2005 resolution and request that in the future the APA base such statements on scientific findings. But the scientific community wasn't the only one making themselves heard. In 2011, in deciding the Brown versus EMA case, the Supreme Court found in a majority ruling that there were no credible studies that connected video game violence to real-world violence, and that video games were protected speech under the First Amendment. The scientific community shared similar concerns about the validity of early video game violence studies. The early studies had serious methodological flaws, especially when it came to the standards for measuring aggression. The methods used did not meet clinically validated standards for aggression, particularly because these better standards tended to produce weaker effects in media violence research, thus making a significant connection between media violence and aggression impossible to prove. As well, even acting in good faith, researchers conducting a study might choose methods that help support and prove their initial hypotheses. The newer studies that account for and correct the methodological flaws of the earlier studies have all uniformly shown that violent video games have no impact on increased aggression or violence, or on long-term behavior at all. However, not everyone is convinced. One of the more well-known proponents of the idea that violence in video games increases aggression and violence in the real world is researcher Dr. Brad Bushman, who recently gave a lecture in 2014 at BYU. Bushman gave his thoughts on the issue of video game violence. He was quoted as saying, "People who say there aren't enough studies on violent video games don't know what they are talking about. There is little margin for error, and the findings are so statistically significant that there is no question that violent video games affect behavior." He also went on to say that playing violent video games increases aggressive thoughts, angry feelings, emotional arousal, aggression, can make people numb to the pain and suffering of others, and that all of these effects are massive and statistically significant. Lastly, he finished off by saying, "We don't let our kids smoke cigarettes, drink beer, or play with guns. Let's protect our children. Let's make sure they don't consume age-inappropriate media." However, Bushman's statements do not line up with facts. The Supreme Court and a large body of the scientific community doing media violence research would fall into the group of people who don't know what they are talking about, according to Bushman, both having found significant fault with earlier research. As well, all new research that has accounted for the flaws from the earlier studies has resulted in the conclusion that there is no impact on behavior or aggression caused by violent video games. Of the new studies done, only one was able to connect a statistically irrelevant 0.5% increase in aggression to video games, and confirmed in a later study that it was the competitive elements, not the violent content, that had caused that. The risks associated with smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, and mishandling firearms are proven and real. There is no such risk proven to exist for playing violent video games. So in conclusion, I reassert that I do not believe that violent video games cause behavioral problems, as older studies into this issue were flawed, and several recent studies on the issue have determined that there are no long-term behavioral effects. I appreciate your time. Thank you.